Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, here to lead you through tonight's chilling journey. If you find these stories help you unwind or gently guide you to sleep, consider supporting the channel by liking this video and subscribing if you haven't already. It truly helps bring more of these stories to you. Also, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and the time where you are. It's always fascinating to connect with listeners around the world. So, take a deep breath, settle in, and prepare yourself for a night of mystery and suspense. Jared was scrolling through Facebook Marketplace late one night, half distracted by the glow of his phone. He wasn't looking for anything specific, but the mix of oddities people were trying to sell always fascinated him. Rusty bicycles, barely functioning appliances, and vintage trinkets no one really needed. Then he saw it, a sleek black leather armchair that looked almost brand new. The listing was simple. Chair for sale. $50, pickup only. The price seemed too good to be true. Jared's tiny apartment was in desperate need of decent furniture, and this chair looked perfect. He clicked on the seller's profile, hoping to get some sense of who they were. The account belonged to someone named Luke H. There were no photos except for the profile picture, a blurry silhouette of a man standing in front of a fence. Jared hesitated for a moment, then decided it didn't matter. He messaged the seller. The response was immediate. "Chair's still available. Can you come tonight?" Jared blinked at the screen. It was nearly 10 p.m. "Isn't it a bit late?" he typed back. "Need it gone ASAP. If you can come now, I'll drop the price to $40. Jared hesitated. The thought of venturing out to some stranger's house at this hour didn't sit well with him. But $40 for a chair like that? It was hard to resist. "Send me the address," he replied. The house was in a part of town Jared had never visited before, far from the busy streets and familiar storefronts. The GPS guided him to a long, winding road lined with trees. Eventually, he arrived at a small, dilapidated house with a single dim porch light. Jared parked and sat in his car for a moment, surveying the property. The house looked even worse up close. Peeling paint, overgrown weeds, and windows that reflected nothing but darkness. He checked the messages again. "Here," he typed. The response came instantly. "Come to the back." Jared got out of his car, the night air cold and still. He walked around the side of the house, his footsteps crunching on gravel. As he reached the backyard, he saw the chair sitting under a large oak tree, illuminated by a small lantern. It looked even better in person. Pristine leather, no visible wear or tear. "Hello?" Jared called out. No answer. He glanced around, the hairs on his neck beginning to rise. The backyard was empty, save for the chair. Jared considered just grabbing it and leaving, but something about the silence unnerved him. He pulled out his phone to message Luke. "I'm here. Where are you?" A reply came immediately. "Take the chair. Leave the money under the lantern." Jared stared at the message. The whole situation felt strange, but the chair was exactly what he wanted, and he was already here. He placed two $20 bills under the lantern and started dragging the chair toward his car. It was surprisingly light, almost as if it were hollow. He loaded it into the trunk and drove home, the unease lingering in the back of his mind. Back at his apartment, Jared set the chair in the corner of his living room. It fit perfectly, adding an air of sophistication to the otherwise plain space. He sank into it, letting out a satisfied sigh. The leather was cool and smooth, the cushioning firm but comfortable. That night, Jared fell asleep in the chair while watching TV. He woke up to a strange noise. It was faint at first, like the sound of fabric shifting against itself. Groggy, he glanced around the room. The TV was off, though he didn't remember turning it off. Then he heard it again. A soft creak, like someone settling into a chair. Jared froze. The sound wasn't coming from the chair he was sitting in. It was coming from across the room. He turned his head slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The chair was empty. Jared laughed nervously, trying to shake off the fear. He must have imagined the noise. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He dragged the chair into the corner and went to bed, locking his bedroom door behind him. The next morning, Jared found the chair back in the center of the living room. At first he thought he might have moved it and forgotten, but as the days went on, strange things began to happen. He'd leave the chair in one spot, only to find it somewhere else hours later. At night, he'd hear faint creaking sounds like someone shifting their weight in it. Once, he came home from work to find the chair facing the front door, as if it had been waiting for him. Jared tried to sell it. He posted it on Facebook Marketplace, just as Luke had. Within minutes, he received a message from someone asking to buy it. "Come pick it up," Jared typed, relieved to be rid of the thing. The buyer never showed. When Jared checked his messages, he saw a reply he hadn't noticed before. "The chair isn't yours to sell." Panic set in. Jared called a friend to help him get rid of it. Together they drove the chair to the local dump and left it there, watching as it disappeared among the piles of trash. That night, Jared felt a weight lift from his chest. He slept soundly for the first time in days. But when he woke up the next morning, the chair was back. It sat in the corner of his bedroom, the leather glistening as if it had never left. Desperate, Jared messaged Luke. "What's wrong with the chair?" he typed. No response. He checked the profile again, but it had been deleted. Jared spent the next few days trying everything he could think of, burning the chair, leaving it on the side of the road, even donating it to a thrift store. But no matter what he did, it always came back. And each time it returned, it seemed different. The leather grew darker, almost black, and a faint imprint appeared on the seat, as if someone had been sitting there for hours. One night, Jared woke to find himself sitting in the chair, though he had gone to bed hours earlier. He couldn't move. His arms and legs were pinned down by an invisible force. In the corner of the room, a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall man with no face, his silhouette blurry and indistinct. "You shouldn't have taken it," the man said, his voice cold and distant. Jared tried to scream, but no sound came out. The next day, Jared's apartment was empty. The only thing left was the chair sitting in the center of the room, waiting for its next owner. On Facebook Marketplace, a new listing appeared. "Chair for sale, $50, pickup only." It was supposed to be a simple road trip. A few friends, a car, and the open road. Tyler, Sam, and Aaron had planned the weekend for months. The plan was clear: drive out of town, get away from the stress of their daily lives, and relax. They packed up their gear, threw a cooler in the back of the car, and set off for a quiet spot outside of town. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow on the open road as they drove down a rural highway. It was peaceful, with fields of tall grass on either side and nothing but the occasional farmhouse or sign marking the way. The three of them were in high spirits, laughing and joking about everything from school to their old childhood memories. "Man, I can't believe we're finally doing this," Tyler said, taking a sip from his soda. "No parents, no work, no distractions." Aaron, who was driving, nodded. "Yeah, we'll just camp out and enjoy the peace. This place should be perfect." Sam, sitting in the back, chimed in. "I heard there's some old abandoned cabin down the road. We should check it out while we're out here." The conversation flowed easily as they continued on their way, unaware of how the peaceful night was about to turn into something they'd never forget. They had just passed the last sign marking the outskirts of town when it happened. The car behind them had been tailing them for a while. At first, they thought it was another traveler just passing through. But as the miles passed, the car stayed right behind them, too close, almost like it was deliberately following. "Anyone else notice that?" Sam asked, looking out the rear window. "Yeah, they've been behind us for ages now," Tyler said, glancing in the side mirror. Aaron frowned but didn't say anything. He just pressed down on the gas, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The car behind them mirrored their every move. Tyler tried to laugh it off. Maybe they're just going the same way. Who knows? But the feeling in the air shifted. The car behind them was more than just a passing vehicle. There was something off about it. The headlights gleamed too brightly, and the car seemed to be too close, too persistent. It wasn't until they made a sharp turn that the car didn't follow. Good. They turned off. Aaron said with a sigh of relief, relaxing his grip on the wheel. But as they continued down the road, they realized they were wrong. The headlights suddenly reappeared in the distance, far too close to be a coincidence. This time the car didn't follow from behind. It was coming at them head-on. "Is this guy insane?" Aaron muttered, swerving to avoid a collision. The car zoomed past them, barely missing the side of the vehicle. Tyler's heart raced. "What the hell is going on? This guy is playing with us." For a brief moment, the car disappeared from sight. But then, just as they approached a bend in the road, it appeared again, closer than ever before. The car was no longer behind them, nor in front of them. It was now on the same road, driving parallel, its headlights blinding in the dark. The boys were starting to panic. "Who the hell is this?" Sam asked, his voice shaking. Aaron pressed down on the gas, desperate to get away from the car that seemed to know every move they made. The road stretched out endlessly ahead of them, but the car kept pace. No matter how fast they went, it was there. The headlights of the mysterious car were now so close that they could see the faint outline of the driver through the rearview mirror. But the figure behind the wheel wasn't just a person. It was a shadow, a dark silhouette with no clear features. It was as though there was someone there, but they didn't belong. "I don't like this," Tyler said, voice trembling. Aaron sped up, the car now pushing 90 miles per hour. They reached a stretch of road where the trees were dense on either side, and there was nowhere to turn off. The mysterious car was gaining ground. They could hear the engine roaring in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Suddenly the headlights flashed, blinding them for a split second. It was enough to make Aaron lose focus. He swerved sharply to the right, narrowly avoiding the ditch that ran along the side of the road. For a moment, everything was disorienting, the world spinning in a blur of lights and shadows. When he regained control of the car, he looked in the rearview mirror. The mysterious car was no longer there. "Where did it go?" Sam asked, his voice strained with fear. Aaron didn't answer. He was still trying to shake the fear that had lodged itself deep in his chest. He kept his eyes on the road, determined not to look back again. The rest of the drive felt eerily quiet. No more headlights appeared, no more screeching engines or near misses. Just the wind rushing past the car and the hum of the engine beneath them. The three of them drove on in silence, the adrenaline still pumping through their veins. When they finally reached the cabin they had been looking for, they parked the car and got out quickly, relieved to be far away from the endless chase. But even as they walked toward the cabin, Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching them. They tried to brush it off as nerves, as exhaustion, but the feeling never left. They set up camp, and the hours passed uneventfully. Yet, every so often, they'd hear a noise from the distance, a car engine, or the sound of something heavy moving through the woods. That night, after they had gone to bed, the wind outside picked up, howling through the trees. Tyler lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the memories of the chase still fresh in his mind. He could hear the faint sound of a car engine, distant but unmistakable. Suddenly, the floorboards creaked. Someone was outside. Tyler held his breath, praying it was just the wind. But then he heard it again. A car slowly approaching, the sound of tires rolling over gravel. It was unmistakable. The headlights flashed through the small windows of the cabin, momentarily illuminating the room. Tyler's blood ran cold. In the morning, the three friends drove back into town, their nerves still on edge. They didn't speak about the incident as if saying it out loud would make it real, but deep down, they all knew they had been followed. They knew the car they had seen on that road wasn't just some random driver. It had been something else, something dark, something that never meant for them to get away. When they reached the edge of town, Tyler checked his phone, relieved to see it was still working. He opened Facebook to distract himself, but his eyes stopped on one new notification. New message from an unknown user. He clicked on it. It was a single image of their car parked at the cabin. The message read, "I'm still following you." It was sent at exactly 3:13 a.m. It started as a curiosity. Madison was a member of countless Facebook groups, from local buy and sell pages to book clubs and true crime communities. Scrolling through her feed one evening, she received an invitation to join a group she had never heard of before. The Watchers Circle. The name intrigued her. The group was marked as private, and the description was vague. A community for those who see beyond the ordinary. There were no posts visible to non-members, only a simple tagline. Once you're in, there's no going back. Madison hesitated. Who sent the invitation? The sender wasn't someone she recognized, and the account had no profile picture, only the name admin. Against her better judgment, she clicked join. The group was unlike anything she'd seen before. It had only a few hundred members, but the activity was constant. Posts flooded in every few minutes, grainy photos of strange symbols etched into trees, videos of flickering lights in the sky, and cryptic messages written in languages Madison didn't understand. The most recent post caught her attention immediately. Welcome to our newest member, Madison K. She froze. Her profile picture and name were displayed at the top of the post, along with a message beneath it. We've been waiting for you. Her heart raced. How did they know she had joined? Before she could think to leave the group, a new message popped up in her inbox. It was from the same admin account that had invited her. Don't be afraid, you're one of us now. Madison typed a quick reply. Who are you? Why did you add me to this group? The response came instantly. You'll find out soon, just follow the rules. Beneath the message was a link to the group's pinned post, titled The Rules. The rules were simple but unsettling. 1. Do not leave the group. 2. Do not share information about the group with outsiders. 3. Do not ignore direct messages from admin. The final rule was the most ominous. 4. When you're summoned, you must answer. Madison wanted to leave, but as she hovered over the Leave Group button, her phone buzzed. Another message from admin appeared. Leaving isn't an option. Her hands trembled. How were they watching her so closely? Over the next few days, Madison tried to ignore the group. She muted notifications and buried herself in work, hoping it would all fade away. But the posts continued to flood her feed, growing more bizarre with each passing day. One post showed a dark figure standing in the middle of an empty road, its shadow stretching unnaturally long. The caption read, "He's watching tonight." Another post was a video of a woman sitting in a dimly lit room, whispering something inaudible. The screen glitched halfway through, distorting her face into something unrecognizable. Madison couldn't help but click on the comments. He'll come for her soon. She's been marked. Don't look away. Madison slammed her laptop shut, her heart pounding. That night, Madison woke to a strange noise. It sounded like footsteps outside her apartment door. She lay still, straining to listen. The sound stopped, replaced by a soft tapping on her window. She lived on the second floor. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A new message from admin. Look outside. Madison's breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to look, but something compelled her to. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window. A figure stood in the darkness, its face obscured by the shadows. Its hand pressed against the glass, leaving smudged fingerprints. Her phone buzzed again. Let him in. Madison screamed, grabbing her phone and running to the bathroom. She locked the door and dialed 911, her hands shaking so badly she could barely type. The call didn't connect. Instead, a robotic voice said, "This line has been disconnected." Her phone buzzed again. "You can't run from us." For the next few days, Madison stayed with her friend Claire, too afraid to return to her apartment. She told Claire everything, but the story sounded too absurd to believe. "Maybe you're just stressed," Claire said, trying to reassure her. "We'll go to your place tomorrow and check things out. It'll be fine." Reluctantly, Madison agreed. The following day, they returned to her apartment. Everything seemed normal at first. No signs of forced entry, no strange messages on her phone. Madison almost convinced herself it had all been in her head. But when she opened her laptop, the Facebook group was still there, and the newest post sent chills down her spine. It was a photo of her and Claire standing outside the apartment building, taken just moments earlier. The caption read, "We see you." Claire stared at the screen in disbelief. How did they get this? Madison's phone buzzed. Another message from admin. She shouldn't have come. That night, Claire disappeared. Madison woke to find her friend's belongings still in the guest room, but Claire herself was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of where she had gone. Her phone buzzed. "You broke the rules." A photo accompanied the message. It showed Claire sitting in a dark room, her face blank and unresponsive. "She's with us now. Don't make the same mistake." Madison knew she couldn't go to the police. They wouldn't believe her, and even if they did, what could they do against something like this? She decided to confront the group directly. She posted in the Watchers Circle, demanding answers. "What do you want from me?" The replies came quickly, flooding the thread. "Obedience. Loyalty. Your turn is coming." The final comment was from admin. "Prepare yourself. The Watchers are near." That night, Madison didn't sleep. She sat in her living room, clutching a kitchen knife, every light in the apartment turned on. At 3 a.m., the power went out. Her phone buzzed one last time. "It's time." The sound of footsteps filled the apartment, growing louder with each passing second. Shadows danced across the walls, moving toward her. Madison tried to scream, but the darkness swallowed her whole. The next day, her Facebook account was deactivated. In the Watchers Circle, a new post appeared. "Welcome to our newest member, Claire B." The cycle had begun again. Enjoying the story? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more creepy tales. Jake had been an avid mountain biker for years. He loved the thrill of winding trails, the crisp mountain air, and the solitude of being far away from the chaos of the city. So when he heard about the newly reopened Ridgewood Mountain Trail, he knew he had to try it. The trail had been closed for nearly a decade after a series of accidents. Rumors floated around the biking community about why it had shut down. Wild animals, freak accidents, or even a missing hiker. But Jake didn't believe in tall tales. He chalked it up to bad luck and poor trail maintenance. On a cool Saturday morning, he strapped his bike to the back of his car and set off, determined to conquer the trail that had spooked so many. The drive to Ridgewood was uneventful. The sun peeked through the trees, casting long shadows across the winding mountain road. Jake parked at the trailhead, where a faded wooden sign greeted him. "Ridgewood Mountain Trail. Proceed at your own risk." He laughed under his breath. Dramatic much? The parking lot was empty, save for his car. That wasn't surprising. Most people were probably still too scared to try the trail. But Jake preferred it that way. No distractions, no one slowing him down. He unloaded his bike, adjusted his helmet, and started pedaling. The trail was breathtaking. Towering pines lined the narrow dirt path, their needles crunching beneath his tires. Birds chirped in the distance, and the occasional squirrel darted across his path. Jake felt alive, the adrenaline coursing through him as he navigated sharp turns and steep inclines. About 30 minutes in, he noticed something strange. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet. The birdsong had stopped, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He paused, straddling his bike, and looked around. The trees were so dense that they blocked out most of the sunlight, casting eerie shadows across the trail. Jake shook his head. "Come on, man. It's just a forest." He pushed off again, pedaling harder to shake the unease. The first real sign of trouble came about an hour in. The trail split into two paths, one marked with a weathered sign pointing left, and the other overgrown with weeds and branches. He squinted at the sign. The paint had faded, but he could just make out the words, "Left, Summit Trail." "Right, closed." Jake smirked. "Guess I'm taking the road less traveled." Ignoring the sign, he turned right, curiosity outweighing caution. The overgrown path was challenging but manageable. The air grew colder and the trees seemed older here, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms. Jake's tires crunched over rocks and fallen leaves as he pushed deeper into the forest. He didn't notice the first marker right away. It was a small carved symbol on a tree trunk, a spiral etched deep into the bark. Jake slowed down to inspect it. "Looks fresh," he muttered, running a gloved finger over the grooves. Shrugging it off, he continued down the path. Then he saw another, and another. The spirals appeared every few feet now, each one identical to the last. They weren't random carvings. Someone had deliberately marked this trail. A shiver ran down his spine, but he pressed on. He was too far in to turn back now. The deeper he went, the stranger things became. The trees seemed to lean closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to form a natural tunnel. The air grew heavy, making it harder to breathe. Jake stopped to take a sip from his water bottle, his hands trembling slightly. That's when he heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, coming from somewhere behind him. He whipped around, heart pounding. The trail was empty. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing through the forest. No answer. He shook his head, trying to laugh it off. "You're spooking yourself. Get a grip." But as he pedaled away, the footsteps started again, louder this time. They didn't match the rhythm of his own movements. They were slower, deliberate. Jake stopped again, his breath catching in his throat. The forest was still, too still. That's when he noticed something in the distance, a figure standing just off the trail, partially hidden behind a tree. "Hey!" Jake called out, trying to sound confident. "You lost or something?" The figure didn't move. Jake squinted, trying to make out any details, but the shadows obscured its face. It was tall, with long limbs that seemed to blend into the trees. His chest tightened. "All right, man, you're freaking me out." The figure stepped back, vanishing into the forest. Jake didn't wait to see if it would return. He jumped back on his bike and pedaled as fast as he could. The trail twisted and turned, the spirals on the trees passing by in a blur. The footsteps didn't stop. They grew faster, closer, until they matched his frantic pace. He didn't dare look back. After what felt like an eternity, the trail opened up into a clearing. Jake skidded to a halt, gasping for air. The clearing was empty, save for a single wooden cabin in the center. It looked ancient, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and time. He didn't want to stop, but the trail had ended. There was nowhere else to go. Jake approached the cabin cautiously, his bike in tow. The door creaked open as he got closer, revealing a dark interior. Inside, a single chair sat in the center of the room. On it was a piece of paper, weighted down by a small stone. Jake hesitated, then stepped inside to read the note. "Welcome to the Silent Path. You should have stayed away." Before he could react, the door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps started again, louder than ever, circling the cabin. Jake pressed his back against the wall, his eyes darting around the room. A faint light flickered to life, illuminating the carvings on the walls. Spirals, hundreds of them, etched into every surface. The footsteps stopped. A voice whispered from the darkness, "Now you're one of us." The light went out. Jake's screams echoed through the forest, but no one was there to hear them. The next morning, a park ranger found Jake's bike abandoned at the trailhead. The Ridgewood Mountain Trail was closed again, this time for good. And deep in the forest, the spirals continued to grow. Kyle had been obsessed with anime for as long as he could remember. He had shelves lined with figurines, stacks of manga, and a wardrobe that was mostly graphic t-shirts of his favorite series, but nothing compared to his dream of visiting Japan, the birthplace of everything he loved. After saving for years and meticulously planning, Kyle finally booked his ticket. His itinerary was packed: Kyoto's ancient temples, Osaka's food scene, and of course, Akihabara, the mecca for otaku culture. He couldn't wait to lose himself in its neon-lit streets, filled with anime merchandise, maid cafes, and endless arcades. What he didn't plan for was the strange, unshakable feeling that would shadow him from the moment he arrived. Kyle's first few days in Japan were everything he had hoped for. He spent hours in Akihabara, hopping from store to store, his suitcase quickly filling with rare collectibles. He marveled at the towering buildings plastered with larger-than-life posters of his favorite characters. On his third day, he stumbled across a small shop tucked into a dimly lit alleyway. Its exterior was plain, almost unnoticeable compared to the flashy storefronts around it. A hand-painted sign in both Japanese and English read, "Rare and exclusive anime memorabilia." Kyle's heart raced. He couldn't resist the allure of something rare and exclusive. The shop was cramped, its shelves packed with items he'd never seen before. Vintage action figures, one-of-a-kind posters, and even props from live-action adaptations filled the tiny space. An older man sat behind the counter, his expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" the man asked in heavily accented English. "I'm just looking," Kyle replied, his eyes darting around the store. Then he saw it. On a shelf in the back, partially hidden behind other items, was a small box. It was unmarked, save for a peculiar symbol etched into its lid, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward. "What's this?" Kyle asked, pointing to the box. The man's expression darkened. "Not for sale." "Come on, everything has a price," Kyle insisted. "I'll pay whatever you want." The man hesitated, then finally sighed. "You don't understand. This isn't a toy. It's something else." Kyle's curiosity only grew. "I'll take it." The man reluctantly handed it over. "Don't open it. Just don't." That night, Kyle returned to his hotel, the box clutched tightly in his hands. He couldn't stop staring at it, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it a collector's item? A prop? Something one of a kind that no one else had? Ignoring the shopkeeper's warning, he carefully lifted the lid. Inside was a small, hand-carved wooden figure. It depicted a person, their features distorted and exaggerated, eyes too large, limbs too thin, and a smile that seemed far too wide. As Kyle held it, a strange sensation washed over him. The air in the room felt heavier, and a faint humming noise buzzed at the edge of his hearing. He set the figure on the nightstand and tried to shake off the unease. The next morning, things felt different. The bustling streets of Akihabara seemed quieter, the colors less vibrant. People avoided making eye contact with him, and he swore he caught them whispering as he passed by. When he returned to his hotel that evening, the figure on the nightstand had moved. At first, he thought he might have bumped it, but as the days went on, the movements became more pronounced. Each time he returned to his room, the figure was in a different position, sometimes sitting at the edge of the bed, other times facing the window. The humming noise grew louder, no longer confined to the edges of his hearing. By the end of the week, Kyle was desperate to get rid of the figure. He returned to the shop, only to find the alleyway empty. The store was gone, as if it had never existed. Panic set in. He asked around, but no one remembered a shop like the one he described. That night, he decided to leave the figure behind. He placed it in the hotel trash can and went to bed, determined to forget about it. But when he woke up, the figure was back on the nightstand, its carved smile seeming wider than before. Kyle's dreams grew darker. Every night, he found himself in an endless hallway lined with doors. Each door creaked open as he passed, revealing twisted, nightmarish versions of the anime characters he loved. They stared at him, their two large eyes unblinking, their mouths moving silently. In one dream, he opened a door to find the wooden figure standing in the center of the room. It raised its hand and pointed at him. Kyle woke in a cold sweat, the humming now a deafening roar. By the time his flight home approached, Kyle was a wreck. He hadn't slept in days, his appetite was gone, and his eyes were sunken and bloodshot. At the airport, he tried to leave the figure in a trash bin, only to find it back in his carry-on bag moments later. When he finally boarded the plane, the figure was in his lap, its carved eyes staring up at him. Back home, things only got worse. The humming followed him everywhere, drowning out every other sound. His friends and family noticed the change in him, but he couldn't explain what was happening. One night, desperate for answers, Kyle turned to the internet. He posted a photo of the figure in an anime collector's forum, asking if anyone recognized it. The responses were immediate and terrifying. "Where did you get that?" "Burn it. Now. That's not a collector's item. It's a curse." One user sent him a private message. "Get rid of it before it's too late. Destroy it and bury the ashes far away." Kyle tried to burn the figure, but the flames wouldn't touch it. He smashed it with a hammer, only to find it whole and unscathed moments later. The figure's movements became more aggressive. He would wake to find it inches from his face, its carved smile seeming almost alive. One night, Kyle woke to find himself unable to move. The figure sat on his chest, its weight crushing him. The humming reached a deafening crescendo, and the last thing he saw before blacking out was its wooden hand reaching for his face. Kyle's apartment was found abandoned weeks later. His belongings were untouched, save for a small wooden figure sitting in the center of the living room. The figure's carved smile seemed wider than ever. Nathan, Emma, and Dylan had been planning their camping trip to the Australian outback for months. The vast arid landscape had always fascinated them, with its endless horizons, ancient rock formations, and the allure of the unknown. They had all grown up hearing stories about the outback, some thrilling, some eerie, but all captivating. This wasn't their first camping trip together, but it was by far the most ambitious. They had chosen an area known as the Whispering Dunes, a remote desert said to be so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. Legends surrounded the place. Stories of travelers who disappeared without a trace, strange lights that danced on the horizon, and the whispers that gave the dunes their name. Probably just the wind, Dylan had joked when they first read about it. Emma wasn't so sure, but Nathan, the group's self-appointed leader, had dismissed her concerns. "Come on, it's an adventure. What's the point if it's not a little spooky?" With their gear packed and spirits high, they set off, unaware of the nightmare awaiting them. The journey to the dunes was uneventful. They drove for hours, the paved roads giving way to dusty trails. The landscape grew increasingly desolate, with sparse vegetation and the occasional kangaroo bounding in the distance. By the time they reached their destination, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and red. The dunes stretched before them, vast and otherworldly, their rippled surfaces glowing in the fading light. "This is incredible," Emma said, snapping photos. Nathan set up the tent while Dylan built a small fire. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted, and the silence of the desert enveloped them. It was unlike anything they had ever experienced. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, absolute quiet. They sat around the fire, swapping stories and laughing, but as the night wore on, the laughter faded. The silence was unnerving, pressing down on them like a physical weight. "Do you hear that?" Emma asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. The others paused, straining to listen. "Hear what?" Nathan asked. "It's like whispering, really faint." Dylan chuckled nervously. "Probably the wind, or your imagination." But as the night deepened, they all heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible murmuring that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Unable to sleep, Nathan decided to step outside the tent for some fresh air. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow over the campsite. He stood there for a moment, staring at the stars, which were impossibly bright in the desert sky. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement at the edge of the dunes. "Dylan? Emma?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. No response. He grabbed his flashlight and shone it toward the dunes, but there was nothing there, just shifting shadows and the endless expanse of sand. Shaking his head, he muttered, "Get a grip, man," and crawled back into the tent. The next morning, they explored the dunes, hoping to distract themselves from the previous night's unease. The landscape was stunning, with towering sand hills and deep, shadowy valleys. But as they climbed one of the taller dunes, Emma noticed something strange. "Guys, look at this." She pointed to a series of footprints in the sand, leading up the dune and disappearing over the crest. "They're fresh," Dylan said, frowning. "But there's no one else out here, right?" Nathan hesitated. Probably just from earlier. Maybe one of us. Emma shook her head. We haven't been this far yet. They followed the footprints to the top of the dune, where they abruptly ended. There were no prints leading down the other side, just an unbroken expanse of sand. How does that even happen? Dylan asked, his voice tight. Nathan tried to brush it off. The wind must have blown them away. Emma gave him a skeptical look but didn't argue. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more distinct. It was no longer a faint murmur but a cacophony of overlapping voices, speaking in a language none of them could understand. Emma clutched her sleeping bag tightly. Nathan, I don't like this. We should leave. Nathan nodded, though he hated to admit it. First thing in the morning. But Dylan wasn't listening. He had unzipped the tent and was peering outside. Do you see that? He whispered. Nathan and Emma followed his gaze. In the distance, at the top of a dune, a figure stood silhouetted against the moonlight. It was too far away to make out any details, but its presence was unmistakable. Is that a person? Emma asked, her voice barely audible. Nathan grabbed his flashlight and shone it toward the figure. The beam of light swept across the dunes, but when it reached the spot where the figure had been, there was nothing there. The next morning, they packed up in record time, eager to put the Whispering Dunes behind them. But as they loaded their gear into the car, they discovered something chilling. Carved into the sand around their campsite were symbols, intricate swirling patterns that hadn't been there the day before. What the hell is this? Dylan asked, panic creeping into his voice. Nathan didn't answer. He was staring at the dunes, where more figures now stood, motionless and watching. Get in the car, he said, his voice firm. They sped away, the tires kicking up clouds of dust as the figures vanished into the shimmering heat of the desert. Even after they returned home, the experience haunted them. Emma couldn't sleep, plagued by nightmares of the symbols and the whispering voices. Dylan refused to talk about it, insisting they never mention the trip again. Nathan tried to move on, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they had disturbed something ancient, something that had been waiting in the dunes for centuries. One night, as he lay in bed, he heard it again, a faint whisper coming from the shadows of his room, and he knew they had brought the desert back with them. The small town of Millfield was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or at least they thought they did. Nestled in a quiet valley, it was the kind of town where nothing much happened, and that's how the residents liked it. That was until a stranger arrived. He appeared one crisp autumn morning, walking down Main Street with a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He was tall and lean, with sharp features and piercing green eyes that seemed to notice everything. His presence was unsettling, not because he looked threatening, but because of the way he carried himself, like he belonged, yet didn't. New in town? Asked Mrs. Jacobs, the postmistress, as the man walked into her shop. Yes, he said simply. His voice was calm but carried a weight that made her pause. He handed her a neatly written slip of paper. I need a mailbox set up. She nodded and processed the request. He didn't offer a name, and she didn't ask. Word spread quickly, as it always did in small towns. The stranger rented a modest house on the outskirts, one that had been vacant for years. He didn't seem to work, but he was often seen around town, sitting in the corner booth at the diner, walking the trails by the woods, or standing at the edge of the lake, staring into the water. The townsfolk speculated endlessly. Some thought he was a writer seeking inspiration. Others whispered that he was on the run from something, but no one dared to approach him directly, save for one person. Tim, the town's self-proclaimed historian. Tim found the man sitting at the diner one afternoon, sipping black coffee and reading an old worn book. Mind if I join you? Tim asked, sliding into the booth without waiting for an answer. The man looked up, his green eyes locking onto Tim. For a moment, Tim felt as if the man could see straight through him. I'm Tim, he said, holding out his hand. The man hesitated before shaking it. "Elliot," he replied. Elliot didn't volunteer much information, but Tim was persistent. Over the next few weeks, he made it his mission to befriend the newcomer. Gradually, Elliot began to open up, though only slightly. He mentioned that he had traveled a lot, that he enjoyed quiet places, and that he had an interest in people. "What kind of interest?" Tim asked one evening as they walked by the lake. Elliot smiled faintly. "Let's just say I like to know things." Tim laughed. "You're not a spy, are you?" Elliot didn't laugh. It wasn't long before strange things began happening in Millfield. Secrets long buried started coming to light. Mrs. Carter, the mayor's wife, received an anonymous letter detailing her husband's infidelity. The local butcher found a decades-old ledger that exposed his father's shady business dealings, and old Mr. Hargrove, who had lived in the town longer than anyone, confessed to a crime no one had known about, a hit-and-run accident from 50 years ago. Each revelation was accompanied by whispers that Elliot had something to do with it. After all, he always seemed to be nearby when the truth came out. Emma, a high school teacher and one of the town's more skeptical residents, decided to confront him. "Are you behind all this?" she demanded one evening as he stood at the edge of the woods. Elliot turned to her, his expression calm. "Behind what?" "All these secrets. People's lives are falling apart." He tilted his head slightly. "I haven't done anything but observe." "Then how do you explain it?" she pressed. Elliot's green eyes seemed to glow in the fading light. The truth has a way of revealing itself when people start looking too closely. As more secrets surfaced, fear began to grip the town. People avoided Elliot, crossing the street when they saw him and muttering behind closed doors. But Elliot didn't seem to care. If anything, he seemed to thrive on the chaos. One night, a group of townsfolk, led by Tim, decided they had had enough. Armed with flashlights and a sense of righteous anger, they marched to Elliot's house. They found the door unlocked and the house eerily empty. Inside, the walls were covered in maps, photographs, and handwritten notes, an intricate web of connections that linked every resident of Millfield. At the center of it all was a single phrase, scrawled in red ink: "The truth is a burden." Elliot returned as they stood there, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. "You've been busy," Tim said, trying to sound braver than he felt. Elliot glanced at the walls, then back at the group. "You wanted answers," he said simply. "What are you?" Emma demanded, stepping forward. Elliot regarded her for a long moment. "I'm just someone who knows things." "That's not an answer," Tim shouted. Elliot sighed, as if explaining something to children. "The truth is all around you. I just make it harder to ignore." The group demanded that Elliot leave town, but he only smiled. "You can't escape the truth," he said. The next morning, his house was empty. The maps, the notes, everything, gone, as if he had never been there. The town tried to move on, but the damage was done. Relationships were shattered, trust was broken, and the once peaceful community was forever changed. Elliot was never seen again, but sometimes, on quiet nights, the residents of Millfield could swear they heard his voice in the wind, whispering, "The truth is a burden." When Olivia first discovered the subreddit Tales from the Abyss, she thought it was just another corner of the internet where people shared creepy stories. A lifelong fan of horror, she loved diving into eerie narratives. Ghosts, monsters, and unexplained phenomena were her escape from the mundane. She read every post late at night, her room lit only by the soft glow of her laptop screen. But there was something about Tales from the Abyss that felt different. The stories didn't read like typical internet fiction. They were detailed, visceral, and often ended abruptly, as if the author had been interrupted. What unsettled her most was the way the posters wrote as if they were leaving breadcrumbs for someone, or something. One night, Olivia stumbled upon a post titled, "The Rules of the Game." If you're reading this, you've already started playing. There's no opting out. Here's what you need to know. 1. They can only reach you if you let them. 2. Keep your windows closed after midnight. 3. If you hear knocking, don't answer. 4. Above all, don't post about your experience here. It makes it worse. She rolled her eyes. It was clever, she admitted, but it sounded like a cheap creepypasta. Still, as she read the comments, her skepticism wavered. Don't ignore this. It started with me too. Now I can't sleep. Rule 4 is real. Don't make my mistake. Scrolling further, Olivia noticed the usernames. None of them were clickable, and many had numbers appended, like they were placeholders, not real accounts. Over the next few days, Olivia noticed strange things happening around her. Her bedroom window, which she always kept locked, would be slightly ajar in the morning. She started hearing faint scratching sounds at night, just beyond her walls. At first, she blamed her imagination, but then the knocking began. It started softly, a single tap 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 at her front door. She lived alone in a small apartment on the 4th floor, and the idea of someone knocking that late was unsettling. She checked the peephole but saw nothing. Just some prankster, she muttered, forcing herself back to bed. The subreddit grew more disturbing. New posts appeared daily, each recounting eerily similar experiences. Contributors described waking up to find objects in their homes moved, mirrors fogged with words they hadn't written, and shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. Despite the warnings, some users posted updates. Those who broke Rule 4 often disappeared after their final entries, leaving their stories unfinished. Olivia couldn't resist commenting on a particularly chilling thread. This can't be real. You guys are just feeding into each other's paranoia. Moments later, her screen refreshed. A single reply appeared under her comment. It's real. You'll see. The username was hers. That night, the knocking returned, louder and more insistent. Olivia stayed in bed, clutching her blanket. Tap, tap, tap. It didn't stop. She finally grabbed her phone and opened the subreddit. A new post sat at the top of the page. She heard it too. She clicked on it, her breath catching in her throat. The post described her apartment, her bedroom, the exact way she was sitting at that very moment. The final line read, "It's at the door. Let it in." The knocking ceased. Terrified, Olivia called her best friend Marcus and begged him to come over. He arrived within 20 minutes, his face a mixture of concern and exhaustion. "Liv, are you okay? You sounded—" "Shh," she hissed, pulling him inside. "I think someone's been trying to break in." She explained the subreddit and the posts, expecting him to laugh or dismiss her. Instead, he frowned. "I've heard about that forum," he admitted. "It's bad news. People say it's cursed or something." "Cursed?" she repeated, incredulous. "Yeah, like it's connected to, I don't know, some kind of entity. The more you interact with it, the closer it gets." Determined to prove Marcus wrong, Olivia spent the next day investigating the subreddit. She scoured every corner of the internet, but there was no record of it existing before a few months ago. The usernames on the posts didn't belong to real accounts, and some of the content seemed to vanish after she refreshed the page. That evening, she decided to post her own story, partly out of defiance and partly to see what would happen. "I don't believe in the rules. I've read them, and nothing's happened. If you're out there, prove it." She hit post and immediately regretted it. Her apartment grew unnaturally cold that night. The lights flickered and the air felt thick, like it was pressing against her chest. She tried to distract herself with a movie, but the screen froze, displaying a single word. "Why?" The knocking began again, this time at her bedroom door. Olivia froze. Her bedroom didn't have a door. It was a studio apartment. Marcus called the next morning, concerned when she hadn't answered his texts. When she didn't pick up, he decided to check on her. Her apartment was eerily silent when he arrived. The door was unlocked, and the inside looked untouched, except for her laptop, which sat open on the table. On the screen was a new post on Tales from the Abyss. It read, "I told you not to post." The username? Olivia's. Marcus slammed the laptop shut and left the apartment, determined never to return. But that night, he received a notification. Welcome to Tales from the Abyss. The game had started again. Caleb was an avid collector of old maps. For him, each one was a piece of history, a glimpse into how people once viewed the world. His collection was extensive, ranging from ancient hand-drawn navigational charts to 20th century road maps. So, when he stumbled upon a weathered leather scroll in a small antique shop on the outskirts of town, he knew he had to have it. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with cloudy eyes and a hesitant demeanor, handed it to him with trembling hands. "Are you sure you want this?" the man asked. "It's not like the others." Caleb chuckled. "That's what makes it interesting." The shopkeeper didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned in closer. "Be careful with it. Some places aren't meant to be found." Back home, Caleb unrolled the map on his desk. It was unlike anything he had seen before. The parchment was ancient, its edges frayed and stained. The map itself depicted a strange landscape, mountains that seemed to twist unnaturally, rivers that defied gravity, flowing upward into the sky, and a single unmarked road winding through the middle of it all. What struck him most was how vivid the map was. The details seemed to shimmer as if the ink were still wet. At the bottom corner, in tiny, ornate script, were the words, "The unknown awaits." Caleb spent hours studying it, but the map didn't correspond to any known location. No online searches matched its features, and even his extensive collection of atlases and reference books came up empty. Frustrated but intrigued, he decided to try something bold. He would trace the road on the map to see where it led. The road started at a crossroads just outside of town, a place Caleb had driven past countless times. That should have been his first clue that something was off. He had never noticed the narrow dirt path that branched off from the main road before. It was overgrown and unmarked, but it matched the map perfectly. Excitement bubbled in his chest as he parked his car and began walking. The air grew heavy as he ventured deeper. The trees on either side of the path loomed like silent sentinels, their branches tangled in unnatural shapes. The dirt beneath his boots was cold, almost unnaturally so, and the only sound was the crunch of his footsteps. After what felt like hours, he came to a clearing. At the center stood a tall black obelisk, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when he tried to focus on them. The obelisk wasn't marked on the map. Feeling uneasy, Caleb decided to head back. But when he turned around, the path was gone. Panic set in as he realized the forest had changed. The trees were closer now, their branches forming a near impenetrable canopy that blocked out the sun. The air smelled of decay, and a faint, low hum resonated through the clearing. He pulled out his phone, but it was useless. No signal, and the GPS was frozen on a blank screen. The map, however, was still tucked into his bag. Desperate, he unrolled it, hoping for some clue. To his horror, the map had changed. The road he had been following was now gone, replaced by a series of jagged lines that led deeper into the forest. With no other choice, Caleb followed the new path. As he walked, he began noticing strange things, shadows that moved without any apparent source, whispers that seemed to come from the trees, and fleeting glimpses of figures in the periphery of his vision. The path led him to another clearing, this one dominated by a small, decrepit cabin. The windows were dark, and the door hung slightly ajar. Caleb hesitated, but the map seemed to urge him forward. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of mildew. The cabin was empty except for a single table in the center, on which lay another map. This one was even older than the first, its edges curling with age. But what struck Caleb was that the new map depicted his town and his house. A red X was marked over his location. The hum grew louder as Caleb stared at the map, his pulse racing. He grabbed it and ran, ignoring the whispers and the shadows that seemed to close in around him. When he finally stumbled back onto the main road, it was night. He had been gone for hours, but it felt like days. Exhausted, he drove home, vowing to burn both maps and forget this ever happened. But when he entered his house, he froze. The map from the cabin was spread out on his kitchen table, the red X now replaced by a swirling black mark. The humming filled the room, louder than ever, as the lights flickered and the shadows in the corners began to move. That night, Caleb disappeared. His car was found abandoned at the crossroads, but there was no sign of him. The only clue was a weathered leather scroll left on his desk. It was unrolled, revealing a new map, a forest with a narrow dirt path and a single, unmarked road winding through the middle of it. At the bottom corner, in tiny, ornate script, were the words, "The unknown awaits." Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. I hope you found some peace and comfort. Before you drift off completely, let me know in the comments what time it is where you are and which country you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. Until next time, rest well and sweet dreams.